Okay, so we were yesterday we were starting to get a little bit more clarity on what's called kovesh schar sachir, withholding a person's wages, paying a person's wages in a timely fashion. And the last thing that we saw yesterday was that uh, in the footnote, we'll just start this footnote again. Whoops, I didn't share the, there we go. He says there's a principle that you have to pay within, before the sun sets after services are rendered. But if there was a stipulation made at the time of the hire that there would be other terms, then that seems to be halachically acceptable. He says, "V'chein mashma midivrei HaShulchan Aruch, shepasak v'zeh lashono. Sochir shemakir bebal habayis she'ein darko lios biyado mos ela biyom hashuk." That if a worker recognizes that the person employing him already has a track record, that he doesn't have cash and carry, he doesn't have the ability to pay until the day of the marketplace. Eina over bival tolin afilu yesh lomos kam lashona. The employer is not going to be in violation of bal tolin, of not paying, or kovesh schar sachir. It's the same prohibition, just using two different terminologies. You're not, that the employer is not in violation if he doesn't pay him that day, because it's implicit when the contract was made that the employee forgoes payment immediately. The cost of hasma, so the Sma in his commentary writes, Perush va'afilu tiva'o baboker rishon ena over beval tolin. He says, and that's true even if the employee, the worker, says, please pay me immediately. Because he knew when going into the job that he would not get paid until the marketplace day. And therefore the employer is not in violation, because it was as if it had been expressed explicitly. And therefore, certainly, if it was expressed explicitly that the terms of the work contract are, what is it, net 30, net 60, net 90, right? Yeah.
120.
Net 120. So if it was already understood that in our industry, people don't pay for the job until, let's say, 30 days out, so then it's certain that the employer is not in violation. The Kain Kosov Hashach Sham B'Zelushono. And the Shach writes the same language, quoting the Sefer Chasidim. In Taskir Sofer Lichtov Lecha, Tatne Imo Shalotia Bevaltolin Pulat Sachir. He says, if you hire a scribe to write paperwork for you, because they didn't have printers in those days, in the 13th century. You didn't even have printing presses. So anything you needed to be done by a scribe. So you need someone to write up paperwork for you, specify with the scribe that I'm hiring you on the condition that I will not be in violation of Baltolin in the event that I don't pay you upon delivery of the parchment. Shema kishiyitva lo yiyalachalitemo, because you don't want a situation where he's going to deliver the goods, ask for payment, and you're not going to have it. He says, however, with that said, if you do have the cash when he asks for payment, don't procrastinate simply because you can. In other words, just because you can delay payment doesn't mean you should if you have the wherewithal to pay him. And he says, and the reason why this is not matna al mashakasav batorah, he says this is not stipulating a condition that is in direct violation of the Torah. Shahare amru chachamim adam matna impoyo lahachil lechem tsaru maim lachatz afal pi shechayv lahachilo kisuda shlomo ad kam l'shono. Because we see from the sages that negotiation of terms can be made in an employer-employee relationships. And where do we see this? we see this with a situation where you hire workers, and part of the work arrangement is that you will supply them with lunch. And that was quite often done if you were a farmer and you were hiring workers to work your field. You would say, you come, you'll report to work at 7 a.m., you finish work at 5 p.m., and lunch is included in the job. They don't do that anymore. Most places don't do that anymore. People require you to bring sack lunch, but people didn't have sack lunches back then, so.
I think a couple of companies have been there. What they do is they have a cafeteria in the basement. Coupons.
Yeah, right. So this is the more primitive way of doing it, was the employer would provide you lunch. So the Gemara asks the question, what is the minimum that you have to give the workers as far as food? So the Gemara says, if you didn't make any stipulation as far as the nature of the food, the Jewish people, even the lowest echelons of the Jewish people, are royalty. So you have to feed them as if they were kings, because how could you treat a Jew any less than royalty? And it's a beautiful idea when you think about it, is that we are a mamleches kohanim. We are a kingdom of priests. We're a mamleches kohanim. We're a kingdom of priests. And so if we're a kingdom of priests, then how could I give anyone less than prime rib and the most expensive delicacies? So therefore, the Gemara is basically advocating it's important for an employer to specify, and this is what's on the lunch menu, because if you don't, you have to splurge on a Jew, which is.
Is that over today?
Well, yeah, like, Moish, when he makes a kiddush, when the brotherhood does a kiddush, he, if he doesn't stipulate what a person wants in his kiddush, he's got to provide
the whole list. Check it out, the box.
Yeah. I'm saying it does, it apply.
No, if I hire a Jewish employee,
yeah.
So I have to make sure that that is mentioned to them. And when I hire
If you
them
provide
If part of the contract is to provide them with food, then you should specify.
But I'm saying when it's not.
Then you don't have to
No,
provide them with
no.
food.
You don't have to provide them with food. What is stated here is that if you stipulate that part of their compensation package is daily lunch, then you should specify what kind of lunch it's going to be, because otherwise you'll be on the hook for a very luxurious lunch. Yeah, right. So, but what we're extracting from that is that we see that you can negotiate, because we're dealing with two parties who can enter into any kind of work agreement that they both are comfortable with. So even though the Torah says do not delay his wages, the caveat is, if, however, the employee is willing to defer payment in order to get this contract, then you are allowed to defer payment as per the terms of the contract. So that's what we're seeing over here. We've seen this. So this is what we saw for the first time yesterday. Okay, and therefore, aval im yesh lo kesef mufkad etzel acherim. So he says. Oh, so basically what he says, V'chein im ein lo l'shalem lo over al halav. He says, if you don't have the money to pay him, sorry. So let's just go back and quote the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch writes, Kasav b'Sefer HaChinuch, Sheroi l'chol ben das sheyachinat hakesef lifnei shesocheret hapoel. The proper thing to do is to set aside the money before you hire the laborer. In other words, have the cash in the bank. V'im ein lo kesef sheyuchal l'shalem bizman, lo yiskor et hapoel. And if you don't have the money to pay, don't hire the worker. Ela im ken yodia lo meirosh shelo yuchal l'shalem lo et scharo b'siyum ha'avoda. Unless you notify him in advance that I'm only willing to hire you if you're willing to defer immediate payment. Ba'az kevin shezeh b'haskamat hasachir hulo over al bal talim. So if the worker agrees and accepts the terms, then you're no longer in violation of Baltalin. Aval lo mekayim bazeh mitzvat aseh shall be yomotitain scharo. However, you will have foregone the positive mitzvah that you could have fulfilled if you would have paid him in the proper time. In other words, in this situation, you're not in violation of the Torah because you stipulated in advance, but you have squandered the opportunity to have performed a positive commandment. V'chein im ein lo l'shalim lo over al halav, shedarshu rabotenu lo talin pu'ulat sachir itecha. Another chiddush that the Sefer HaChinuch brings is that if you don't have the money, then you're not in violation, because the Torah says, do not keep the worker waiting together with you. Kol sheyesh itcha kesef over al baltalin, avalo keshe'en la. Which means that if a person had every intention of paying the worker on time, but for whatever reason he lost his money, so then you're not in violation of baltalin if you can't pay him. You logistically, you can't pay him because you don't have money. So there, the Torah, the Gemara learns that you're off the hook in that case. Aval im yesh lo kesef mufkad etzel acherim. But if you have money that is owed to you and it's in other people's possession, o im yesh lo chafatzim sheyachol limkorotam, or if, let's say, you have goods that if you were to sell them, you could generate cash in order to pay your workers, zen nikra sheyesh la, then you do have the money. You're just not liquid at this moment, but you have assets. So you're obligated to sell off your assets in order to pay the worker. V'yetera mizu kasav be'ahavas chesed. The Chafetz Chaim goes even further, and he says, "De'im yachol lahasig halva'a u'l'shalem hapoel," that if you have the ability to get a loan, yasig halva'a kedei l'kayim et hamitzvah, you have an obligation to borrow money in order to pay your workers on time. So, I mean, that's a pretty hefty requirement. So,
So this contracting out, it's still far from ideal. We're saying that, you won't be over, but you're not doing what you really should be doing. You don't get the mitzvah for not paying on time.
right. That's when you negotiated in advance, right? So you've lost the opportunity to fulfill the positive mitzvah, right? It still always is preferable to conform to what the Torah says. Biyomoti tein scharo. Now, let's say you're a large corporation, like Ron was asking yesterday, and that's just not the way your company is not set up to be able to deliver cash on demand, because you have an accounting office and it's got to go through different layers of and payroll is only on the 15th and the 1st of every month, and that's how we process payments to all of our contractors, right? So, obviously there are going to be mitigating circumstances. So you see that in those mitigating circumstances, you have what to rely upon. But okay. But remember, what was our question? Our question that we started off with yesterday was, we have a guy who's not paying his rent on time. Is he in violation of Baltalin if he doesn't pay his rent on time? So this is is it only for services or is it for goods? So he says this halacha of Baltalin only applies when you hire a laborer. V'hashe'elahi mahadin legabe adam shesocher mechonit odira. What is the halacha if you rent a car, or if you rent or mechonit is a machine, an appliance, or an apartment? When you lease or rent a place, what is there still an obligation of paying wages, of paying the rent on time? Hine hagemara bebava mitzia darsha me hapasuk ba'artzecha shezeh kolel kol davar sheba'artzecha. So the Gemara looks at the pasuk, and I guess the pasuk in the prohibition of Baltalin includes the words in your land. We just look up the pasuk. Let's find that word. Ba'artzecha chaf daled yadaled. Lo ta'ashok sachir ani ve'evyon. Do not oppress the worker who is poor and downtrodden. Me'achecha, if he's among your brothers. O migerecha, or if he's from among the righteous strangers among you. Asher ba'artzecha, that is in your land. Bisharecha, in your gates. Now, why does the Torah have to use those added words? Shouldn't this halacha apply whether you're in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz? So the Gemara learns from this word ba'artzecha, shezeh kolel kol davar sheba'artzecha. This includes anything that you might find in Eretz Yisrael. L'rabos schirus kelim kegon mechanit uchedome. This comes to include the rental of utensils, like an appliance and so forth. Sheyesh bo mishum biyomoti tzein scharo, v'gam mishum baltolin pulat sachir. That is so that's included in this prohibition, which is sort of surprising. I wonder, does Rashi make a point of saying that? Okay. Yeah, Rashi does actually make a point of saying that on Chumash. If you take a look at Rashi, first of all, the word migerecha refers to a righteous convert, a Jew who is a convert to Judaism, and bisharecha, in your gates, refers to ger toshav, ha'ochel nevelos, refers to a righteous Gentile who eats non-kosher food, meaning that he observes the 7 Noachide laws. So we see that someone had asked the question, does this law apply to non-Jews? If he's an upstanding non-pagan Gentile, then it applies to the Gentile as well. Asher ba'artzecha l'rabot sochar behema v'kelim. This comes to include when you rent an animal or utensils, you also have an obligation to pay the rental fee immediately upon, I guess, the termination of the rental period, I would assume. But let's see, what is I'm just wondering, what is the Torah Tamima? He probably quotes the Gemara directly. L'rabot sachar behema v'kelim kesachar adam, just no different from if you hire a human being to work from you. He's quoting the same Gemara. And so what does the Torah Tamima say? So if we take a look at the Torah Tamima, he says, Nira da'iri b'chlei macharesha uzriya v'yeter klei hasada. This refers to, let's say, if you lease a plow or other, let's say, utensils that are used for farming. Okay, umipnei distam behema v'kelim eluhem basada lachein darish kein milashon artzecha. And it's the reason why we derive it from the word in your land is because these are typically things that are used when working the land. That's why the Gemara says from the word ba'artzecha, in your land, does not mean specifically if you're in Eretz Yisrael, but rather it means if you are working the soil, anything that's involved in working the soil is subject to this restriction or requirement that you pay for it when payment is due. Avolo shayach lemait min ba'artzecha b'chutz la'aretz, lomar she'ein ze noeg b'chutz la'aretz, but it doesn't mean that this halacha of paying your wages on time only applies in Eretz Yisrael and not in Chutz La'aretz. Yan ki mitzvah zu chovat haguf hi ve'ina tluya ba'aretz, because this mitzvah is on the person and therefore has nothing to do with where you live. And so therefore this mitzvah applies equally in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Va'ayin b'tur Choshen Mishpat reish siman shin lametes hevi b'shem harama da al socher karka ein ovrim alav de lo ta'ashok schar socher, that he brings from the Rama, and this is really the subject of our tshuva, that if you rent real estate, like renting an apartment or renting a home, you're not in violation of baltolin if you don't pay the rent on time. The darshinan kol asher be'artzecha velo kol artzecha, because we learn that it's be'artzecha. It has to be in or upon your land, but not the land itself. So the land itself is not subject to the prohibition of baltalin. Only things that are on land, such as humans and appliances and animals and so forth.
So
If
it's
you
not
rent a farm-
connected, if you're renting an apartment and you have services from the building, if you don't pay your rent on time, it means that the management cannot pay the employees because it's like, so it's like,
I understand. So what we have to see is how far does this thing that it's real estate go? What if there are additional services that you get by being part of the apartment, like the homeowners association? And remember, we said that the tenant has to pay the what is it? The condo owners association bill because he's getting the services.
right.
Does that apply? Is that considered to be part of the rent, or would you parse that out and say no, those are services that you have to pay on time? Ve'ime atzmo darish kain tema heich ra'a lidrosh medinafshe ba'od shahadin hazem meforish lehepech b'Toras Kohanim parshas Kedoshim. So the Torah Tamima asks a very interesting question. He says, where did the Ramah, who's one of the Rishonim, where did he get this idea from that you're not in violation of Baltolin when it comes to leasing real estate? He says, I don't understand where he gets this from, especially in light of the fact that the Medrash in the Sifra seems to say the precise opposite. It says, Lo talin pulat sachir, minayin larabos sachar hakarkos. That this is quoting the Medrash directly. Where do we know that this prohibition of Baltolin applies even when you rent real estate? Talmud lomar, lo talin pu'ulat kol davar. As it says, do not delay the wages. And from the word wages, we learn the wages of anything. Imlo shenomar, the hamilim sochar hakarkos minaim shebetaras kohanim, he hosafa betos. Unless we were to say that there is some kind of maculation or error in the text of the Sifra. He says, the Gemara lo nizkar mizeh, because the Gemara makes no mention of this. The gam ikar hadrasha b'taras kohanim pulas kol davar mashma demar birak behema v'kelim hapoalim. He says because the drasha of pu'ulat kol davar, the wages of anything, implies that it's including just animals and appliances that belong to the workers. The gam hakelim poalim al yedei acher, where they are working via the workers. Aval lo karka, but it doesn't seem that real estate would be included in the word pu'ula, because the real estate is not working, is not doing any work for you. The harkarka hu nif'al velo poel, because real estate doesn't work, it is worked upon. Velo shayach lomar pu'ulat hakarka ki im sechara. He says, because you don't say that the land worked, you say that the land was leased or rented. So, va'ayin, okay. So basically, he is in a bit of a quandary. The Torah Tamima, he doesn't understand unless you say that there's some error in the Midrash, and the Ramah did not have access to the version that we have because the Midrash is in error. So let's see what Rav Sharaga says on this discussion. So he says, "Aval legabe schiras karka, katav maran b'shulchan aruch," that the Shulchan Aruch writes, and he's quoting the same source that the Torah Tamima quoted. Yesh mi sha'omer she'eno over. Some say that you're not in violation when you don't pay for real estate on time. Usfaraso mishum shenemar asher ba'artzecha velo artzecha mamish. Because the pasuk says that is upon your land and not the land itself. The Sachar karka nikra artzecha ve'ein bo mishum biyomotitein sechara. And therefore, if you rent real estate, it's called artzecha, not be'artzecha, and therefore it's not subject to the laws of biyomotitein sechara, pay the wages on the same day. Because of Choshen, the zedavka sachar karka mamish kamo migrash chaniya uchedoime. But the Ktsos writes that only refers to actual land. So, for example, if a person rents a lot, a person rents a parking space, that's where we say that's mamish real estate. That's land that you've rented. And therefore it's not subject to the prohibition of Baal Tolin. Avol bayit shenivne me avanim shahayu tlushim ve'achar kach chibaro tam bevinyan. But a domicile, a structure that was built above ground, that was made out of stones or bricks or wood, and then was attached, those items were attached to the soil, yesh lo din talush be'achar kach chibaro. That's where you have things that are made out of detached items, which were later attached to the ground, and therefore they are subject to the prohibition of Baal Tolin. No different if you rented an appliance. V'hosif sham haktzos hachoshen, and the ktzos goes up further. He says the afal pishiyesh omim shetalosh ve'achar kach chibro dino kimechubar, that even though there are those who say that if something was detached from the ground and then it was attached to the ground, then it's no different from real estate. Yesh lechalek ben isser lebein mama. There would be still a difference between something that is usser and something that is a monetary obligation. That when it comes to a prohibition in the Torah, you are not allowed to rely on the fact that it is real estate. You must give it the stringencies of chattel. You have to go according to those opinions who say that it is like chattel, it is like something that was originally detached and then later attached, and therefore it is subject to the obligation of biyomo titain scharo, of pay the wages on time. So essentially, what he's arguing, what the Choshen Choshen argues, is that rent for a house or for an apartment is subject to the prohibition of Baal Tolin, which is quite a chiddush. So he says, the ayin b'tshuva haba. We're going to see in the next tshuva, shehevi rabbeinu hagon hamachaber shlita esdas hayireim disfirale degam bekarka mamish yesh iser Baal Tolin v'shekein isa b'toras kohanim. That we're going to see in the next tshuva that according to other opinions, even with real estate, where it's not something that was simply attached to the ground, but the ground itself, if I rent a lot or something like that, I am still subject to the prohibition of Baal Tolin. And therefore, concludes Rav Sharaga, V'lachein, b'sechirus dira, tzarech lekayim mitzvahs biyomo titain secharo. When it comes to renting a flat, renting an apartment, you must pay the wages of what the rent on time. And we'll have to continue this in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. We'll continue the bottom line. And it seems like there's not a lot of wiggle room. If the rent is due on the first of the month and it's due on the first